Good morning. My name is Steve Marr. I'm with Risk Management Professionals, and thank you for joining us on our continuing webinar series dealing with process safety management, risk management program, safety and environmental management systems, and related programs for onshore, offshore, and various state ARP programs. This is an outreach of our consulting services in these areas, and what our objective is to share with you some tips, some ways of getting the job done practically, and really showing how to apply PSM, RMP, and the related programs to your everyday activities in the most effective way possible. The topic for today is right on target for that objective, and it's focused on the development of effective operating procedures. The challenge that a lot of folks have is you've got operations staff who really know the equipment, really know what they're doing out in the field, but often don't really want to sit down and write procedures for how to do it. Then you've got a lot of folks who can write properly and organize, but they don't really know how to deal with things in the field. So pulling those things together is very conducive towards supporting your safety program and making sure that everybody applies the best practices towards plant operations. So that'll be our focus point today, is development of effective operating procedures. But before I introduce the speaker, let me go ahead and give you a little bit of logistical background to make this a little easier for everybody. We're using a WebEx broadcast point that provides two-way communication, so we really have to put everybody on mute. During the course of the presentation, you'll be on mute. Our speaker will be presenting the topic. You'll see the speaker's image in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You're welcome to resize that by grabbing the edge of the window as appropriate. You'll also have the opportunity to see the slides as they go past during the course of the presentation. Also, there'll be a question-and-answer period at the end. You'll have an opportunity to interact with the speaker. You can also interact with other participants. And during the course of the presentation, if you need to interact with the producer, so they say there, go ahead and hover on the top of your screen. There'll be a pull-down menu, a chat button, and you'll be able to pose technical problems, questions. If you want to interject something, that can go to the producer. And it's also an effective way to ask questions at the end of the webinar. And without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker, Colin Schultz. He is a graduate of UC San Diego in chemical engineering. He's involved in HAZOP, compliance audits, HMPs, and a wide range of PSM and RMP applications. And one of the applications where he's done some very special work is in development of effective operating procedures. And he'd like to share some tips and insights from some of the projects he's been involved with. So let me welcome Colin.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everyone. As Steve mentioned, today we'll be having a discussion on the development of effective operating procedures. And as he mentioned, these are just some of the things I've noticed in my work on certain projects here at RMP. So the key topics that we'll be talking about today, first I'll do a little bit of some background into CalARP, RMP, PSM. We'll look at the different requirements of them and just the elements of each, and how operating procedures is just one element of an effective safety management system. From there, we'll look at the basics. We'll start with the regulations for operating procedures. In this particular instance, we'll focus on Program 3 and Program 2 and the differences between those two for RMP and CalARP applications. From there, we'll get into the core of our discussion, the meat of it, which is about developing and implementing operating procedures. And from that, I'll address different information sources I've found work best in the actual development stage. I'll also point out some general tips and observations, and I'll highlight some common deficiencies as well. Finally, I'll just have a short summary to wrap everything up, and then from there we can move into questions. So again, some RMP, PSM, CalARP background. Before I move forward, I just want to make a note that operating procedures are one element of this, but they're also elements of offshore applications as well, both here in the U.S. and internationally. And so RMP has previously addressed offshore applications of operating procedures through a SEMS webinar that we broadcast in May of 2011. So if you're interested in that, you can access it through our outreach section of our website, www.rmpcorp.com. So how do we get here? This slide presents a collage of some photos of significant process safety incidents. So each of these incidents has involved the release of a hazardous process chemical, and that release has, in these cases, led to some disastrous consequences. So this list here is just a select list of significant process safety events, and it's not inclusive, and you can see it spans some 70 years. And so what these events have done is they've led to drives in both industry and regulation in order to try and improve process safety. So some general observations we can take from these process safety incidents is that all of these major accidents have caused significant loss of life, injuries, loss of property, and on top of that, they have indirect costs as well. These include loss of business, business interruption, and business downtime. Going hand in hand with that, there's lost company confidence or contracts, and also increased regulation. When we analyze these events, we can look at them and kind of identify the root causes. Usually there's something simple, which from a bird's eye view is kind of a failure to maintain the design intent of the system. And because of that, we've evolved to develop both industry and regulatory initiatives to have process safety. And process safety is not only a business management tool, but it's also a mindset, a safety culture, if you will. And as part of that, we've implemented safety management systems. So as I mentioned, we've had some regulatory initiatives as well as industry initiatives. In '92, OSHA came out with its process safety management of highly hazardous materials, so that's OSHA PSM. In '96, 40 CFR 68 was EPA's risk management program. States also had initiatives. Here in California, in '94, Cal OSHA had its own PSM program. And we also have the California Accidental Release Prevention Program, CalARP, which is analogous to EPA's RMP. Again, this is just in California. Other states also have their own ARP programs as well. So specifically for RMP and CalARP, the safety process is broken down into several different program levels. Program 3, full compliance, is the most stringent requirements. And so the regulations mandate specific prevention program elements. There's Program 2, which is reduced compliance, and that includes some less stringent results, but it still dictates certain prevention program elements. Program 1 is the least reduced compliance, I guess you would say, and it does not specify specific requirements for prevention program elements. So I've been mentioning this term elements all the time. This graphic on your screen should highlight the different elements for CalARP or RMP Program 3, and this is analogous to OSHA's PSM standard. And so starting at the top and going clockwise, we have your process safety information, your process hazard analysis, operating procedures, training, mechanical integrity. And so what I want you to take from this is just operating procedures is one element of having a very effective and diverse safety management system. As part of that, there's some other elements too, including the hazard assessment. In California, we have the seismic assessment, and then there's also emergency response and submittal formulation. So moving on to CalARP or RMP Program 2, as I mentioned earlier, this is a little bit less stringent than Program 3, so there are fewer elements involved. In this case, there's safety information, hazard review, and these are kind of analogous to elements of Program 3, just a little bit less inclusive. Again, what I want you to take away from this is operating procedures is just one element of an effective CalARP RMP program. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we're going to start our discussion by looking at the basics of operating procedures, so we'll address the requirements of them. But before we do that, I just want to make a quick note about why we have operating procedures. So I'm not sure how much you can read this figure, but it's a process safety beacon. And this highlights an incident where there was a release of chemicals. And so in this particular instance, a truck driver came to unload a chemical to a facility, And when he arrived, he told an employee what he was dropping off. In this case, he said Kempo 700. And so the plant employee took him to the connection rack, which is the figure in the top left. And you can see that there's 6 different pipe connections. And in the picture on the right, you can see that there's 2 connections, one labeled Kempo 700 and the other labeled Kempo's liquid added. And so right away, that's kind of similar. And so that's a signage issue there. But anyway, the plant employee connected the Kempo 700 truck to the Kempo's liquid added tank and started unloading it. And so in the picture on the bottom, figure number 3, you can see an orange toxic gas cloud was the result of that. Luckily, in this instance, there were no fatalities, though there were some injuries and obviously business costs. So we have operating procedures in place. First and foremost, to provide a documented way to safely operate the process. And note I say documented in there because if someone knows how to do it and they just do it, then that doesn't necessarily preclude other people from operating it in the exact same way. So by documenting that process, it makes it easier to audit. It also makes it easier to apply. And going hand in hand with that is minimize human error. By having a documented process, it's easy to cross-reference between different operators. Another useful point for operating procedures is to ensure consistency. And by eliminating deviations, you can not only maintain quality control, but back as I mentioned with the significant process safety incidents, a key factor here is by maintaining the process within the design intent, you could hopefully reduce the likelihood of having catastrophic failures. Finally, one more point I just want to note is document best practices before alteration. In this sense, if you have one employee, one operator that really knows how to operate the process, if he leaves, then you want to be sure you capture all that information. And so I'll say this a couple times throughout the presentation, but the end goal of operating procedures is to really encapsulate everyone's knowledge, all relevant knowledge, in a way to safely operate a process. So just starting with the regulations, we have operating procedures requirements. First and foremost, your operating procedures must address each phase of operation. And the phases are listed below. Some things I want to point out are emergency shutdown. The procedures usually need to reference conditions under which an ESD can be performed, and also the assignment of responsibilities to qualified operators. I know that in emergency shutdown situations, there's sometimes confusion. And so by having a clear and effective emergency shutdown procedure in place, you can hopefully mitigate any results, any potentially disastrous results by having an effective program in place. Also, startup following a turnaround or after an ESD is something to note. In some facilities, it may be the same as initial startup. In other facilities, you may need to do some tweaks in order to get it back to a safe starting point. Continuing on with requirements, I should note these are primarily for RMP Program 3, which is analogous to OSHA's PSM. In a few slides, I'll get into the differences between Program 2 and Program 3. So again, your operating procedures must also address operating limits. And this is going back to that point about maintaining the process within its design intent. As part of those operating limits, you should have consequences of deviation and steps required to correct or avoid those deviations. So if an operator is running a process and maybe there's a tank and he sees high level in that tank, he should know what to do. What are the possible causes of high level? If there's a need for alarm, and the ways to bring the level back down into its safe operating limits. Procedures must also address safety and health considerations. These include hazards of your chemical, PPE required, or other engineering controls or administrative controls you need to have in place, unique or special hazards in that sense. And safety systems and their functions must also be addressed. This can include things like safety interlocks, emergency shutdown systems, things of that nature. And finally, the last requirements are that they must be readily accessible to all employees. I've been to facilities where laminated copies of the procedures are kept at workstations, and that way operators always have reference to the operating procedures. Typically, a master copy might be kept with the operations manager or maybe on the company intranet, but by having a copy at the workstation, you would ensure that your operators have no incentive not to follow the procedure. If it's right there, you make it easy for them. Updated regularly is a major issue, and when I talk about common deficiencies, I'll note that this is something I see regularly. Program 3 facilities are required to certify their procedures annually, and in addition, operating procedures must be updated whenever a major change occurs. And I would say not even necessarily whenever a change occurs, but also if you have more information that may help your operating procedures become more robust, it would be good practice to update them accordingly. Finally, they must also address safe work practices, including lockout tagger procedures, confined space entry, things of that nature. And as part of that, your operating procedures need to address both your own employees and contractors as well. Just kind of piggybacking off of the requirements, a lot of this is reiteration, but the responsibilities of the owner-operator are first and foremost, ensure your employees are trained on your procedures and they have procedures available to them when they're performing their operations. Again, updating the procedures is a key responsibility in order to ensure that your operators are always operating the process in the safest way that you know how to do it. And going hand in hand with that is certifying them annually for Program 3 facilities. And last but certainly not least is ensuring contractors have written operating procedures. Again, in common deficiencies that I note, contractors usually are kind of left to do their own thing, even though they might be working on the owner-operator's regulated process. So this slide just kind of points up a comparison between Program 2 and Program 3 requirements. I noted that the previous slides were focused on Program 3 requirements, and so the Program 3 column on the right side of your screen should be pretty straightforward. Program 2 is reduced compliance, and therefore the requirements are a little bit less stringent. However, written procedures for each phase of operation are definitely required, as well as consequences of deviation. The procedures must also be updated for any major changes that occur to the process. One thing they address is equipment inspections need to have procedures. But some things that they don't necessarily need to have by the regulations are certified annually, although it is, I recommend that to people just as a way to ensure that their procedures are always up to date. So now I want to move on to really the core of our discussion, which is developing and implementing operating procedures. So here's where I'm going to talk about things I've noticed in the projects I've worked on and other tips I've had in developing operating procedures. So information sources, whenever you sit down to actually write procedures, you should always gather up all relevant information to the process, and that can include the design intent of the system, and that can also include things like control loop narrative or maybe the cause and effects. Going after that, vendor equipment manuals. A lot of times a manual for a specific pump might have a key note to do during startup, or maybe some cautionary statements that are worth including in your procedures. Additionally, P&IDs are always good to have on hand. Old procedures are also keys to hopefully give the project team a good base of maybe old knowledge that hasn't been passed on. As far as design of the system, the process hazard analysis or maybe other safety reviews are key tools to have in your possession. These help with documenting the consequences of deviation. Corporate standards are always a good thing to have for large companies that might have a wide degree of facilities that need to be encompassed by these procedures. And also general operator engineer knowledge and experience is always good to have. I've been in situations where I've come on board to write procedures, and an older, more experienced operator might have something that come out of left field, and it's a very valid point, and I would have never thought of that based upon my reading of P&IDs and maybe vendor manuals. That's always something good to bring to the table. I mentioned this earlier, but the key goal is to encapsulate all relevant knowledge so that you can safely operate the system, and that's really what operating procedures are for. And just note here at the bottom, operating procedures are living documents, as are the rest of your CalARP and RMP and PSM programs. And as part of that, they should be constantly reviewed and updated anytime new knowledge or information is made available. So just some general practices in the development phase. First and foremost, when you're working with a format, you need to get a template going. And the template should be made early on in the phase of development to save time and resources. And it also should be vetted by all stakeholders in the process, both operators, engineers, management. So as part of that, by ensuring engineering support is happy with it, they can get the information they want to convey. By making sure that operators are involved in the template, it can be user-friendly for them since they're the ones that are going to be using it. And also management to help satisfy not only regulations, but also other hazards that may arise as part of the process. Some other things to note is that the format should be used typically throughout the facility, although that depends on the needs of the facility. Having different procedures, completely different formats for similar procedures within the same facility often leads to confusion when operators are switching between processes or different procedures. Some other things is that it should be easy to reference, easy for cross-referencing, and that way an operator can, if there's a question about a specific step, an operator can easily pinpoint what that is, and it's easy to ask questions, it's easy to double-check that and reference it. As far as the steps of procedures go, clarity is the key, and the end goal is to make it user-friendly. I would recommend one main action per step. You would want step 1, open this valve, instead of step 1, open this valve, wait for this to happen, close that valve, and open another valve. By breaking up in different steps, it makes it a lot easier to follow and also to audit as well. Just another thing, flowcharts or graphics are also sometimes good to use. They can help depict things that might be more difficult to convey using words. A few more general practices in the development stage. Your procedures may potentially be applicable to multiple people. In those instances, you might want to use checklists with assigned responsibilities. Maybe for some safety critical procedures, you'll have one operator go through and do it, and then another operator would have to go through and verify everything just to get a second set of eyes on that. Also, flowcharts and other graphics could be used to help illustrate responsibilities. I know in emergency shutdown or emergency operations procedures, having some sort of flowcharts are a good way to pictorially represent the flow of what the response measure should be. And finally, the last note is you want to ensure that your procedure is thoroughly reviewed, both in the development stage and also during the life of the document. And because of this, you want the procedures to reflect the safe operation of the process. Sometimes it's taken that, oh, the procedure says this is the way to do it, but maybe if the procedure was incorrectly developed, then that procedure could introduce more hazards into the process. And so really you want to get support from operations, engineering, other stakeholders, just to be sure you get lots of different eyes on this document to make sure that you don't introduce any other hazards in the process as per the SOP. So now let's move on to some more tips and best practices I've noticed from visiting facilities and also from working on procedures. Obviously, you want to have full implementation according to the standards and regulations. A key thing to have is operator familiarization, use, and feedback. Again, this goes back to me mentioning that operating procedures are a living document, and as part of that, there should be a constant dialogue going about how can we make this procedure best, especially if you have multiple operators working off of the same document. You want to make sure it makes them all happy while at the same time maximizes the safety of operating that process. Some other notes are incorporation into a local area network or maybe company intranet. This facilitates making access a lot easier for all employees. So that way, if an operator wants to figure out how to operate a process, you can just quickly pull it up and look at it. Likewise, if engineering support has a question, you can look up the SOP and make sure that the SOP is in accordance with best practices. Specific responsibility for update milestones. That's a really important thing to have. As I'll note in common deficiencies, one of the most common things I see is for program view facilities, their operating procedures are not certified annually. And so by assigning specific responsibility or maybe giving document ownership to someone in maybe operations group, you can really help ensure that your procedures will be updated and certified for the milestones. Use of photography and sketches, as I mentioned, graphics are a great way to help make it more user-friendly. and I'll have some examples later on in the presentation about that. Just some more tips and practices. I won't go through each of these bullet points, but again, review and update by operations personnel as part of orientation training or on-the-job training. As I mentioned earlier, operating procedures are just one element of an effective PSM, RMP, or CalARP program. And so, again, this is just focusing on operating procedures, but training is a whole other element. And as part of that, all your operators should be trained on the procedures, and you should have documentation of that training. Templates is also important. I noted back in the development phase that you want to have a template early on in the development process. That way, you can ensure that everyone is happy with it, and you know what the end product is going to look like. I've been involved in projects where the template has changed throughout the life of the project, and it makes it kind of hard to establish a clear target, and no one's really sure what the end goal is going to look like or the end product. Just a few more things. Apply checklists as necessary. Again, as I mentioned, the safety critical operations. Having checklists is a great way to ensure that you have everything done, and maybe getting a second pair of eyes so that you'd have two operators require an initialization of that procedure. Avoid duplication of process safety information. Process safety information is another element of an effective CalARP RMP PSM program. And your operating procedures should include enough process safety information to help operators safely operate the process without having to constantly refer to your PSI. But it should be noted that you might want to consider avoiding duplicating information because, as I mentioned, your program is a living program, and your PSI might get updated. And just to ensure that by having the same information in two places, it reduces the likelihood that you'll forget to update it in one place when you update it in another place. Prolific use of referencing, that's a great way. A lot of procedures reference the PNIDs, which makes it a lot easier to understand what the step is doing from the process-wide perspective. And in addition, well-designed procedures can be used as a computer-based training basis. So as I said, training is another element of a PSM program, and by incorporating your operating procedures into that, you can really help your operators get training on the process. Just a few more notes about this. Printed copies. Consider making printed copies, not controlled versions. I've seen instances where procedures have been printed, but then maybe the Word document of the master copy gets updated, but then the hard copy out at the workstation does not get updated. And so you might want to consider maybe putting an effective date of 2 weeks on every printed copy, or maybe just a note saying that the printed copy isn't the controlled version, and the controlled version is an electronic copy. And that way someone knows if it's a safety critical procedure, yeah, they might have a hard copy in hand, but they should always verify it with the electronic version beforehand. Periodic audits of operator practices. Again, this goes back to the fact that your operators might not be performing the procedure and the way that the SOP outlines it. So by having periodic audits, you can ensure that your operators are performing the procedure according to the SOP, and if they aren't, figure out why. Maybe they weren't trained properly, or maybe they know a hazard that isn't reflected in the SOP. So that's something good to note. And just a more general statement, high quality generalized procedures might be, just depending on the needs of your facility, they might be superior to less maintained and more specific procedure. So if you have a bunch of pumps that are the exact same in your facility, you might just want to have one pump startup procedure that you can reference in more general plant-based documents. So now I just want to talk about some common deficiencies that I've seen through my visits to facilities and also working on operating procedure projects. I mentioned this previously, but the biggest thing I've noticed is that operating procedures are outdated or the annual review is never performed. I've seen it within the same calendar year, which is good, but oftentimes this annual certification isn't necessarily done at the exact month. Another issue is operating procedures aren't current or accurate for all normal operations. This reflects back to the fact that operators might not be performing the operation in accordance with the document, And that's why I would recommend having periodic audits of your operator's performance, not necessarily performance, operations. And finally, I want to note procedures not in the language of the user. As Steve was kind of mentioned, no, thank you. As Steve mentioned earlier, it's easy for maybe engineering to have maybe some decent technical writing skills to write a document, but that might not be in the language of the end user, the operator, who in this case would really know how to operate the process, but wouldn't necessarily know the best way to write the procedure. So this can be mitigated by having multiple stakeholders involved during the development process. Some more deficiencies I've noted is each phase of operation not listed. I would say this is really strong for temporary operations. And I'll get into this later, and you could really have a whole other presentation on temporary operations. But you should just note that all operations at your facility should be encompassed by some sort of SFE or something along those lines. Emergency shutdown job assignments aren't assigned. As I mentioned earlier, if you do have an emergency shutdown situation, you want to have a good, effective document in place to ensure that everyone knows what their responsibilities are, what actions they're allowed to take or should be taking, and who to contact in those cases. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the training elements as well, to ensure that your operators are trained in emergency procedures as well. Acceptable alarm set point range, not documented. This goes in along with the operating limits requirement of the operating procedures. So if you have an operator working on a process that maybe has a tank that he's watching the level of, if you don't have the alarm set points in the SOP, he might not know, A, if there's an alarm going off, what that means. Does he have a lot of leeway between that and the high alarm that might shut down the whole plant? So it's good to document these so that the operators have a good, effective tool just to reference in case there's some sort of small upset condition. And again, this goes back to maintaining the process within the design intent and trying to minimize these deviations that could lead to catastrophic failures. Another note that I've mentioned several times throughout this is contractors' tasks are not included in operating procedures. That's a big deficiency I've noted. So I want to give you another example of consequences of changing your operating procedures without addressing all the hazards. Here I've highlighted another process safety beacon. In this case, there was a stripper used to separate some sort of solvent oils and heavy oils, and once a year it would go down for annual maintenance, and the procedure dictated that maintenance personnel would need to wait 24 hours in order to allow it to cool before they opened it up. In this one instance, they decided to decrease the turnaround time, so they decreased the time to 12 hours. So the operators were under the impression that the 24-hour cooldown period was to protect themselves from hot surfaces. But when they opened up the process after 12 hours, they saw smoke coming out of it, and they didn't actually see flames necessarily, but they knew that there was some sort of fire going on inside. Luckily, in this instance, there were no fatalities. I don't believe there were any injuries. But what the root cause was is, as I mentioned, these operators thought that the goal of the 24-hour cooldown period was to protect themselves against hot surfaces. What they didn't consider was the fact that the solvent and oil residue inside the stripper might still be above its auto ignition temperature. So it still was, and in this case, when they opened it, they had a fuel, they had a heat source, and then they just introduced oxygen into the system, so it auto ignited. So what I want you to take away from this is that whenever you change your procedures, you should really look at any additional hazards you might cause by that change. And also something else to note is make sure your operators are trained to know all the hazards that they're dealing with. In this case, they just thought it was a temperature hazard for their own body, but there was an auto ignition hazard that they were unaware of. So now I just want to move into some tips for organization for operating procedures. I'll include some graphics of things I've seen that I like, or I think I might work well for your facility. And again, it's just dependent upon the needs of the facility itself. Things I like are pictures and ranges or outcomes to expect from operation. So pictures make it a great way for operators to really go out in the field, see the steps in the procedure, and actually see what it is they're doing. It might be difficult if a procedure just says, open valve next to pump, and you might not be sure which pump it is, or there could be multiple valves. And so in this example, you can see there's one action per step, verify pump is in manual, turn the HOA switch to hand, and there's a picture of it, so you can see the switch that they're talking about. You can see the indicators on the dial so that you know which position the HOA switch is. In addition, ranges of outcomes to expect from operation. I know in some instances, there's not necessarily a clear failure or success criteria to determine if the procedure failed or succeeded. So in this emergency shutdown procedure, again, it has a picture of the ESD switch in case anyone at the facility was unfamiliar with it. But the step is to activate the ESD button, and then it notes the button will shut down the compressor skid, which includes the compressor and the cooler. So right away, someone that's walking through this procedure will note that if they push the ESD button and nothing shuts down, there's a criteria right there that they know if that step failed in the procedure. Consequence of deviation and operating limits are another thing I wanted to point out. Sometimes graphics are a good way to do this. You can see from the chart below that we have some controllers here. There's a pressure controller, a level controller, and a temperature controller. Then you can see the low shutdown points. You can see the high shutdown points, the set points, and the alarm points. And in this case, the high for that pressure controller lists the interlock that it sets off. And that way an operator will see, oh, I'm approaching that high, let me see what happens. So he can reference the cause and effect and see interlock 001. Oh, that'll shut down my compressor and trip my main process valves. So this is just a good tool to use so that your operators not only know where they're supposed to be, but also the consequences of what happens if they deviate from that design intent. Moving on to some consequences of deviation, here's an interesting example. In this troubleshooting guide, we see that the deviation is maybe your fire detection system has no signal. So the consequences of that are if there is a fire hazard, you might not get a signal that there is a fire, so you'd be left in the dark. So this provides steps to correct or avoid that. In this case, you check the wires on that, make sure that your device is plugged in. Another interesting thing is to check the detector window. Maybe it somehow got dirty, and so it's blocking your detector from its range of vision. So again, consequences of deviation are a really good troubleshooting tool in this sense in order to help operators know, okay, I'm seeing a deviation here. What are the possible causes? What are possible ways to fix it? And again, this is the end goal of this is to try and maintain your process within its design intent. Just a couple more issues. High priority tasks should have a specific individual assigned to them. This is really big for the annual certification, as I mentioned previously. This is also important for maybe your operations lead is the owner of the procedure. And so by signing that on the document itself, you would know that if there have been any changes, they should be run through your operations lead. This sample format right here has a lot of good things to take away. It has the effective date and expiration date of the procedure. It has the PPE you need. It has tools you might need. It has the training required. Again, one of the requirements of CalArp RMP PSM is to have all your operators train on their procedures, and so this will list the required training that your operators need to have. And again, just looking at the actual step itself, you see step 1, it references a P&ID, has a description of the step, and it includes a column for maybe steps to avoid deviation or other specific safety and health hazards specifics to that step. And then possibly an initialization if it's a safety critical procedure and you want your operators to initial that they've done it. Another thing to consider is at the end of a procedure, maybe having a supervisor signature, and that required sign-off will ensure that your procedures are properly followed. So just to a little summary about what we've talked about today. Operating procedures are just one element of an effective RMP PSM CalArp program. Again, they're not specific to onshore facilities. Offshore facilities have those as well, and those are addressed through the SEMS program. We looked at the requirements of operating procedures, and just to quickly go through them, they need to address each phase of operation. They need to address consequences of deviation, safety and health considerations, and you need to update those accordingly. And finally, the one thing I really want you to take away from this is that operating procedures really are a living document, just as the rest of your CalArp RMP PSM program. And because it's a living document, you really need to, there should be a constant dialogue going on about that document, as well as the rest of the elements of your program. And remember, the end goal of this is just to really maintain your process within safe operation. And so that's really the end goal of safety management systems in general, and specifically operating procedures. So I'll open up to questions right now, if there are any.
Okay, and also let me help identify how we're going to do this. Like I said before, we do have the ability to establish a multi-party two-way communications. We can have a discussion group that goes on if you want to pose the question yourself. We also have the ability, if you'd like to chat with our producer, Solveig Sather, that you can go ahead and use the chat window and issue a question to the moniker RMP Corp. But before we get started, I think, Solveig, did you want to say something?
Yeah. Everybody can...
No.
All right. I just wanted to mention that the source of the CCPS process safety beacon examples that were used in this presentation is the Center for Chemical Process Safety, CCPS, and the beacon is free of charge, and anyone may sign up to receive it on the CCPS website. If you would like a link to the site, please email registration@rmpcorp.com.
Thank you.
Nice tip. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. And can I step here and help
Please.
us? Okay, all right, cool. Solveig, any questions?
Actually, yes. Can you please explain the term temporary operation?
All right, the question was, please explain the term temporary operations. And I mentioned that earlier in the presentation. This is kind of a note. A lot of facilities might not necessarily have them in place. And it's kind of a gray area, and I think the way I'll answer that question is by stating that at your facility, any routine operations should be covered by some sort of document, be it an MOC, maintenance procedures, temporary operations, maybe addressed in a different form of normal operations. And so the key thing to note about process safety is that any operations need to be covered by some sort of document that's been audited as a safe document and audited as your operators have been trained in it. So that's really what I want you to take away from this. Do you have anything you want to add on that?
Oh, may I? Okay.
Please.
Okay. All these safety management systems programs are all performance-based. It's a matter of achieving an objective. Your objective is to provide a safe environment for employees, also the environment, the community that may be nearby your facility. All these things are achieved by making sure that you really don't have any gaps, that you're not doing actions at a plant, whether it be part of a continuous process or something that's intermittent or something you do occasionally that's not somehow managed to the degree necessary to achieve safety. And so that's really what it's all about, is if there are gaps in any sort of unusual operating mode, is to fill those gaps with appropriate training and, as necessary, procedures to the level of detail necessary to achieve your safety objective. Again, everything is performance-based.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, we have another question. Whom do you recommend to perform annual certification? Indicate unit operations supervisor. This is an engineer. What level?
Did you want to start, or do you want to start?
Sorry.
Okay, great. The answer is there's no specific title or position that provides somebody with the ability to do that. It really has to be somebody with knowledge of operations and with cognizance that the procedure is implemented properly and has been updated properly. when you get an audit from a regulatory body like OSHA or EPA, they're really going to be looking at it as the person signing it off have knowledge that the procedure is correct, that it's being implemented properly. So it doesn't necessarily, and also with the proper authorities. So usually it falls on a unit supervisor or somebody at the managerial level, but those things aren't specifically defined. It's really more in terms of the job activities rather than a specific position title.
I'd like to note on that regardless of who it's assigned to actually sign off on the document, there really should be a team involved in the procedure process. And the team should include all stakeholders, including engineering, operations, as well as any other relevant people. And so even though only one person is required to certify these procedures, there should be a group of individuals involved within the review process.
Good, very good.
Okay, next question. What is the best method to address consequences of deviations in an SOP?
Did you want to start?
Unless you'd like to.
All right, best method to address consequences of deviations. Obviously, it's a documentation item. You've got to make sure that whatever the deviation is, that the consequences are documented in the procedure, and that the operating personnel. I'm sorry, I should repeat the question first. The question was, what's the best mechanism for addressing consequences of deviations in operating procedures? My answer was really focused in terms of making sure it's documented, making sure the documentation is properly emulated to the people who need it through training. And a key thing that a lot of people we find gapped at a plant site is, where do you get those consequences? How do you know what deviations are out there? A lot of them come from the process hazard analysis. The pinwheel diagram that Colin showed you early in his presentation showed all the various elements of a safety management system program. These things interact. They're not all separate. They're not all done by different groups that ignore everybody else. So the folks who do the process hazard analysis, just like as operations representatives are included in that, the results of the process hazard analysis can be used to identify deviations that need to be highlighted as part of the operating procedures and training. And Colin, did you want to add to that?
I think you did a good job covering that, and I just want to say on the documentation level that is really applicable to the needs of the facility itself. But as far as where to draw that information from, the process hazard analysis is a really good tool. When I've written consequence of deviation, I've started with the PHA, and then I've also sat down with operators and asked them what their opinion is, and then that's been reviewed by engineering personnel as well. And so as far as the documentation part goes, I would say that's really dependent on the needs of the facility. But what you want to be sure to do is make sure that you capture all the key consequences and the common consequences as well, and present it in a format that's user-friendly to your end user.
When we started this webinar earlier, I mentioned the title is certainly, there's some key words there: development of effective operating procedures. Development and effective. That's your key objectives in terms of pulling these things together. As I mentioned, there's many commonalities to challenges in pulling these things together. You've got people in the field who really enjoy being in the field, doing their thing. They don't necessarily enjoy sitting down and writing procedures. There are people who are desk jockeys, primarily like myself, who sit down and write reports and write procedures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to get involvement by both the individuals at your plant site to pull these things together and create something that's effective and useful. And as Colin said, it's a team effort. Everybody's got to participate because you need all those different disciplines, all those different perspectives on things to really have something that addresses your performance-based standard of making things work.
We have more questions. How stringent has the annual certification requirement been regarding 365 days? Is within the same month plus 1 year acceptable?
Would you like me to start?
Please.
All right, good. The essence of the question was, I'm sorry, go ahead. All right, good. Yeah, the essence of the question was, how stringent do folks interpret this annual certification? Is it exactly 365 days, 0 hours, and 0 minutes? Is it plus or minus a few days? Is it in the same month? And the answer is there is no answer. There's no one item. However, what it depends on, if you're looking at an audit from an OSHA, EPA, a state regulator, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it's primarily dependent on, it doesn't really represent a deficiency in your performance. A good auditor is going to look at that and go like, okay, you missed the deadline by 2 days, but this is a low hazard process. You didn't change anything in your procedure, so there really was no impact. And so they might let it slide. Now, keywords there, letting it slide. If it's a high hazard process, if the procedure is a piece of garbage, which I've seen a lot out in the field, where basically you've got a set of written instructions that have no reflection on what people are actually doing out in the field. If you've had accidents, if you've had incidents, if you don't have a good relationship with your regulatory body, all those things can really add up to missing it by 5 minutes can mean that you can get cited for it. And in terms of citations, people do get cited for this. It is really easy for a regulator to, even if they're fairly new, to go into a plant site and look at the annual certification requirements in your operating procedures and say, oh, you missed one, here's a citation. You don't have to make it easy for folks. These are things that, you know, they're periodic updates. I know everybody's busy. You've all got way too many jobs to do nowadays. But the fact is, if you need to have somebody provide you with ticklers, provide you with reminders periodically, these are things that are easily missed, but also easy to control with some discipline and some reminders that you might generate internally. Colin, did you want to add to that?
No, I think Steve did a good job answering that. I just
what he's really trying to say is Steve talks too much, but that's okay. Everybody knows that.
I had a bullet point in the presentation that just noted, make sure you assign specific responsibility requirements to meet these milestones. And by assigning that, you could have the owner of that document know that it's on his plate, and then from there he could delegate to other people their responsibilities to remind him, and just creating a kind of web there just to ensure that nothing falls through the cracks.
Very good.
We have several more questions.
Good. This is terrific.
Can you please point out some written guidelines recognized and
early household
guidelines. Could you point out some written guidelines recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices on operating procedures?
Okay. Did you want to start? I can start if you'd like.
Oh, please. Yeah.
All right. All right. So the question was, did you want to point out some guidelines and recognized and generally accepted good practices for the development of operating procedures? I think that's basically if you take a look at a lot of the tips that Colin provided in his presentation, he's really trying to show you practical ways for developing effective procedures. There are books out there for writing procedures. Ian Sutton has a very detailed book on writing operating procedures that is definitely worth a read. But again, this is a performance-based standard. The same approach, the same guidelines, the same level of detail that you might use at one facility just doesn't make sense at another facility. It doesn't even make sense for different units within a facility where one may be a highly hazardous process and one may not be as detailed. The one thing I think I will mention is that whatever guidelines that you may fall back on, whatever standard templates you use, and there are those out there. In fact, one of the nice things is that this is the year 2012, and it's not like hand-scribing procedures back in the 60s or 70s. You've got access to a lot of new computer software that helps you organize, easily insert diagrams, photographs, a lot of the tips that Colin provided that make your procedure very effective. You've got the ability to insert hyperlinks. How do people learn things? If you watch even a kid on the internet, you know, when they want more information, they'll click on a link and continue to dig down until they get the information they need. All those abilities are in contemporary software where you can put it, you can create your own template, or use somebody else's template. There are software packages out there that do that can help you define this and make it very effective. We actually have software products, SEMS solution for offshore facilities and PS solution for onshore facilities that do this. But the key thing is, even if you get a software package like that that helps you get it set up, it's got to work with your infrastructure. It's got to work with the way you do business at your plant site. If just a simple Microsoft Word template with hyperlinks works, it's readily available software. You don't need anything special. If you want to standardize on something special, there are packages out there. Again, it's a performance-based standard, so you want to adopt something that's simple, effective, and works at your facility and with your culture. And did you want to add some more to that?
I believe you covered that well.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Next question. How do maintenance procedures compare to a written SOP?
Did you want to start?
Sure.
Okay.
So the question was, how do maintenance procedures compare to a written SOP? And so I'll begin by stating that in the pinwheel diagram I had earlier in the presentation, there were different elements of an effective CalArp PSM RMP program. Operating procedures was one of them. Mechanical integrity is another one. And as part of mechanical integrity, you are required to perform maintenance, preventative maintenance, inspections and testing on your equipment. And so as far as a written document for maintenance goes, I know a lot of facilities use the vendor manuals for specific pieces of equipment, like a pump manual might include the step-by-step instructions on how to drain your oil and flush it maybe, or compressors might include some step-by-step instructions about how to change maybe a filter in there. So again, it's just dependent upon the needs of the facility. If you have a maintenance task that is performed regularly, if it's not covered in a vendor manual or your mechanical integrity program, then it should be documented in some sort of procedure.
Very good.
Do you want to add anything to that?
No, thank you. That's good.
Still more questions? To what extent should contractors have written operating procedures? And what is the most practical way to address this with the contractor before they come to our facility and when they come to our facility?
Okay, can of worms. Did you start or you want to start?
Please start.
Okay. Okay, the question really revolves around how do you deal with contractors and manage them? Do they need their own special procedures? How do you make sure they're following your procedures? Contractors are used to various extents for specialized tasks, or often almost synonymous with employees at some large facilities. There are requirements as the owner-operator of let's back up a step. Okay, all these programs, SEMS, PSM, RMP, are performance-based programs. You're trying to achieve a safety objective. Now, that safety objective includes safety of people, the environment, and the community. People include your employees and also contractors. So whatever is going on at that plant site that you're operating, and you as the operator are responsible for operating, you've got to have a program that makes sure all these things come together. Controlling people who are not your employees and are part of another organization is one of the most difficult challenges because there are always gray areas between what they're doing, how to control them, and making sure that all the operations are done safely. So how do people do that? There's no one answer. But what does need to happen is, as the owner-operator of a company, you need to make sure they're doing their job safely. Most people do it with familiarization training and having the contractor go through at least a safety orientation at that facility. They also test for a certain degree of competence that the contractor is paying attention. They may define skills that the contractor must have that they enforce the contracting company to administer, implement, and test for. And that's often done as part of a contract between the operating company and the contracting company. And it gets even ickier when you've got sub-tier contractors. I'm sorry, is that a technical term? Yeah, okay, definitely ickier when you've got subcontractors of contractors. and the owner-operator is still ultimately responsible for them, and how are they enforcing that their contractor, the prime contractor, is monitoring and managing their subcontractor. So it's a very tough nut to crack. Most owner-operators handle it with contracts, written contracts, and with safety briefings. And again, it's really challenging. Did you want to add anything?
I did not have anything to add other than, as I noted in the common deficiencies part, I've noticed a lot of facilities struggle with the contractor's element of operating procedures, as well as the contractor's element of CalArp RMP PSM as well.
What a lot of folks do, and this varies by industry, refining and maritime oil and gas processing, where you're dealing with the ones that are administered by the Coast Guard, have a quick card that you have to get basic security clearances, background checks, etc. There are also various organizations that manage the paperwork associated with that. If you're an owner-operator, there's organizations that will vet the contractors ahead of time and put them on an approved list of folks that where this company has checked their paperwork, they verified they meet certain specific minimum requirements. Those are things that are often done in the oil and gas industry. They're starting in the ammonia refrigeration industry and some of the other ones, and that's often a way to get the job done, is basically have an organization kind of vet the different contractors that you might want to use at your plant site.
And next question. Any thoughts on balancing what is maintained in a formalized based training program versus detail in the SOP?
Did you get that, or you want to ask me to repeat the question?
Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah. Any thoughts on balancing what is maintained in a formalized based training program versus detail in the SOP? I don't know if that means.
So the question was
computer-based training program. Okay, you got it. All right, good.
A good way to balance the level of detail in computer-based training, CBT, as opposed to what should be included in an actual SOP document. Is that correct?
Yeah. That sounds about right.
All right. So as I mentioned in one of my tips and best practices, something that is a good orientation or training tool is to incorporate your operating procedures within computer-based training, CBT modules. And so I think as part of that, going back a step further, you want to look at your SOP as a document that your operator has been trained on in order to safely and effectively operate the process in a level of detail that's suitable to the process. And so in a computer-based training module, if you're training on a specific procedure itself, then it should be in a corresponding level of detail to that SOP. But if it's more so on an orientation-based training just for the process itself, then I don't think it would have to go into as much detail.
That's fair, and I would like to add with respect to structuring operating procedures and computer-based training. If you're looking at crystal ball a few years ahead, I think you're going to see the operating procedures, the formats, how they're structured, start resembling more and more what people are comfortable with and refer to as websites nowadays, where basically you're looking at something that not only gives you information, can provide you with step-by-steps, but can increasingly, you can click on hyperlinks for additional information, drill down and drill down. I'll go a step further. Gosh, just over the past couple of years, smartphones, the speed, reliability, the ability to process all this information, you're going to have more and more people using handheld devices that not only provide them with the basic steps to keep them out of trouble and keep them safe, but as necessary, they'll drill down, get more details, and that will result in, I think, a greater ability to train, because people, there's a reason why the internet looks the way it does. That's a natural way that people learn things. So it's going to increase the ability for people to learn things and do their job safely. Oh, I would like to add something else too, totally separate subject. We're getting a lot of questions, very much appreciated, but I would like to make an observation that the reason why we're getting a lot of these questions is because This is a challenging task for everybody in terms of developing effective operating procedures. Everybody struggles with it. Whoever's tuned in, you're not the only one who's trying to find a way to manage and encapsulate all this good information in terms of best operational practices. Everybody struggles. It does take time. It is not an easy task, but it does deserve the utmost of your attention to it to have a good safety program.
As long as we're on that note, Solveig, I wanted to verify that my contract information is currently presented.
Yes.
Okay. So if you do have, we're still taking questions, but if you would like to have further discussion after the fact, my contact information is up there as well.
Next question. Have some of the deficiencies that you mentioned earlier resulted in citations and fines from regulatory agencies?
Do you want to start?
I'll let you start this time.
All right. Yes. I'm sorry. It's not meant to be a flippant answer, but the fact is that, as I mentioned before, just not doing your annual updates are an easy target for an agency to home in on. When you look at the 2008 National Emphasis Program that was done by OSHA, deficiencies in operating procedures ranked, I think, in the top 6 in terms of things that people were cited for or fined for. And when you look at these newsletters from the EPA at what people are actually getting pinged on for this, operating procedures typically come out at the top. So the answer is yes. It certainly is, like I mentioned, a tough nut to crack and deserves a lot of your attention.
You covered that well.
Okay.
Can you contrast the differences in operating procedures between onshore process facilities and offshore facilities?
Did you want to start, or you want to start?
I guess I'll start. So as I mentioned, we had a webinar back in May of 2011 done by Carlos Cheek, and the title of that was Sensible Operating Procedures for Offshore Facilities. And in that sense, Carlos did a really good job in this presentation. He kind of looked at Deepwater Horizon as an example and used that as a case study to try and go through the actual implementation of operating procedures. So again, there's similar requirements, and operating procedures are just one element of an effective safety management system. Did you want to add anything?
Sure, a little bit. Let's look at the big picture. All right. Every facility is different. Every company is different in terms of their culture, how they do things. Every individual is different. So how do you learn? How do you control operations? And how do you meet the objectives of these performance-based safety management systems? Everything is different. That's the challenge. That's why a lot of people struggle with this. The good news is that there's more similarities than differences. When you look at onshore facilities, whether you're looking at a major refinery or a small chemical storage facility, versus offshore facilities and complex offshore platforms, whether you're looking at Gulf of Mexico, whether you're looking at international, whether you look at it across the entire spectrum of applications of process safety management, risk management programs, the state ARPs, and also safety and environmental management systems requirements for offshore facilities. Most of these have very similar challenges, and the answers for how to address those challenges is also more similar than not. If you take the same tips and examples that Colin provided in his presentation and applied it to a simple onshore facility, most of that would apply also to a complex offshore facility. Now, there are some things that you need to watch out for. For offshore facilities, you typically have more stepwise operations that you need to be careful, that need to get detailed and may change a little bit more frequently. You need to do a job safety analysis in a lot of cases that dovetails with the operating procedures. And there's actually software packages that help you, like ProSaint, that will help you identify the specific steps. And once you define the steps, start giving you the basics for an operating procedure and your JSA at the same time. So there's a lot of tools. There are some differences as you go from industry to industry, offshore to onshore, but most of the tips, most of the examples that Colin provided apply across the board in terms of how you approach this whole concept of performance-based safety management systems.
All right. I think, let's see. No, there's 2 more questions. One of them was, what was the OSHA 2008 study you mentioned before, Steve?
If I've got the dates right, it's the National Emphasis Program, and I can go ahead and provide I'll go ahead and provide a little slide that provides a little pie chart along with the citation areas to all the participants as a follow-up item.
Okay.
I'll include that in the next presentation.
There you go. Well, people want to know what to not get in trouble for.
How has contemporary software changed the way we create and manage operating procedures?
Okay, I'll go ahead and repeat the question. How has contemporary software changed the way we create and manage operating procedures? I think we've touched on that a couple times. Colin had several tips in terms of building in hyperlinks, interfacing with computer-based training. I also mentioned some software packages out there. We have a package, PS Solution, SEM Solution, but the key thing is there's a lot of tools out there that allow you to do this easily. Put in figures, put in hyperlinks, make updates easily. That's the key thing. This is never static. Once you develop an operating procedure, it will change. That's why they have these annual update requirements. But the key thing is to pick something that works for your facility. It doesn't make any sense at a lot of facilities where you get one person super trained in one software package and then they decide to get another job, either at that company or outside, and then you've taken all that training on this specialized software package that nobody else knows how to use, and it's all on the coop. So you've got to look at your culture, your applications, think ahead. Not only what are you doing right now, but what are you going to be doing in a year, 5 years, 10 years in terms of managing your facility and safely and doing operating procedures. So yes, there are some software packages. It's so much easier to do stuff now in 2012, but look at how you actually do business and what's sustainable at your facility when you pick software. Sometimes simpler works just great.
We have not a question, but a comment from one of the participants. Don't forget to have the actual field operators participate in the procedure development. They know what can and cannot be done physically or logically.
Hey, you know what? I'm gonna pass the mic to you.
Yeah.
Is that all right?
Okay,
All right. Do we have any other questions?
No, I think we're done.
Okay.
A comment that was sent in from one of today's participants. Don't forget to have the actual field operators participate in the procedure development. They know what can and cannot be done physically or logically. Also, a big red flag regarding operating procedures is if you ever hear an operator say the words "on my shift," that tells you that every shift does not do it the same way. Thank you for the comment.
Yeah, just a quick note on that. Thank you for bringing that up. As I mentioned, you want to make sure you have personnel from operations involved in the development process. I've been on operating procedures projects where there's a procedure written, and then we actually go and field walk down the procedure. And in those cases, we've noticed, hey, that valve is really high up, and it might be difficult to operate, or maybe there's some equipment in the way. And so it's good to flush those out sooner rather than later.
Perfect. Solveig, anything else?
I believe that is a good thing.
Okay, great comments. Thank you for the feedback for all the people who have been offering some information. Good questions, and also thanks to all for participating. And do we know what our next webinar is? Okay, none of us, we're all scratching our heads to try to give you a date in terms of exactly what the next topic is. You'll see it. We'll keep you on distribution. Thanks for attending, everybody.
Thank you.